when Mel first invited me to do this program, she really wanted me to update everyone on any type of like bills that have to do with solitary confinement. And I had to give her the sad news that sadly this session, none of the bills made it. So there are actually no bills that have to do with solitary confinement. But I did want to talk a little bit about what solitary confinement is, how it's affecting most particularly our youth nowadays, especially in Florida. And then kind of tie that in with how there are current bills that have to do with juvenile justice in session that indirectly could affect those in solitary confinement, and how indirectly it could lessen our numbers. Florida right now is a state with the highest numbers and with the harshest policies for juveniles as far as sentencing them. We have the zero tolerance in school, so we're really literally funneling them through our prison system. And then once they're in there, there's just so many policies that put them more at risk of falling in solitary confinement. So there are two reports that I kind of like gathered some information for this presentation that are from the ACLU. They're both available online. One of them is called Growing Up Locked Up, and it talks about the all the youth in solitary confinement around the country. That one was published in 2012, and it really interviewed 125 young people in 19 different states, those 19 different states being the ones with the harshest policies. So obviously there's a whole specific study case on Florida. And then also our Alone and Afraid report, which talks about the effects of solitary confinement on the youth, and that one was just released in November of last year. So in those reports, we did a lot of interviews trying to speak with those youth who were in solitary confinement. And I just wanted to read two quotes from two people who described what they felt like in solitary confinement. One of them is from a letter that she wrote while she was in there, and she said, "Being in isolation to me felt like I was in an island all alone, dying a slow death from the inside out." Another quote from a different person is, "Being in a room over 21 hours a day is like a waking nightmare. Like you want to scream, but you can't." And this is all coming from youth, so it's pretty heartbreaking for me to even.
Are these persons that have been found adjudicated or not adjudicated? Are those cases that are adjudicated, or are they just waiting?
Both. It's just people, because we did some of pre-trial cases, and some who were already kind of in the system and kind of were taken to solitary confinement for whatever reason it might be. So some of the effects of solitary confinement for children, obviously there's a lot of psychological harm. There's way more information on psychological harm found in adults who are in solitary confinement. So based on that, just in 7 days after they are put in solitary confinement, they can already start seeing hallucinations, having trouble sleeping, dizziness. There's cases of self-mutilation, and so we can only imagine how much at risk youth would be, considering that they're still developing. They need way more social interaction than adults would. So really, the time 1 day for an adult in solitary confinement is completely different for a child for 1 day being in solitary confinement. There's also a lot of development harm that affects the youth more than adults, just because, again, they're still developing. So in a lot of the cases, once they're taken into solitary confinement, Mel mentioned, sometimes they're not allowed to go outside. So there's a lot of lack of exercise, and a lot of the reported cases where they are allowed to go outside, they're only allowed to go outside in a very restricted area. So there's concern about development, growth, and how that's going to affect the child. There's also a lot of physical harm, not only because they're not getting the exercise they need, but they're also not getting a lot of the nutrients they need for a growing body, and also because they're not getting education they need. So within the prison system for juveniles, it's already very restricting as far as how much education they're getting, if any. And when they're put into solitary confinement and they're there, days, weeks, even months at a time, they're not getting any type of education. So there's really, it's really harmful as far as considering it a rehabilitation program, because it's not really rehabilitating anything. because if that is the case, and once they're in there, they can add more days, like you said, for different things if they're making a call, if they're acting out, which really like being in there makes them act out. They're angrier at the whole situation. But so the days get prolonged, and really they're not getting an education. So that really is going to harm their whole, not only development, but once they're out, how they're supposed to assimilate back into community. Another thing that we're concerned about is, tying in with the physical harm, is the obvious higher risk of suicide rates. In Florida, the Department of Justice found out that more than 50% of the suicide cases in children who were detained in facilities occurred to people who were alone at that time, right? So 50% of the people who committed suicide were alone in isolation or in their cells. And out of all the cases of suicide in Florida, 60% had been in isolation before. So it's a very obvious, higher risk that's more likely to happen. So really the question is, why are they being put in solitary confinement in the first place? So there are 4 big reasons why they would be put there. The first one would be as punishment, right? Disciplinary solitary confinement. The second one is for protective reasons, and that's a tricky one in Florida because it's supposed to be protective from other youth or children who are in there who may be propose some type of harm for them. But in Florida, a lot of the youth are placed in adult prisons as well. So when that is the case, for their own safety, they have to be placed in solitary confinement because a lot of them, and this is a problem in Polk, don't have like a separate space for them not to separate them, right? So they have to put them in solitary confinement for their own safety. The third one is administrative isolation, which happens usually at the beginning stages when they're first starting to get into the facility or being transferred to the facility. Sometimes it's a very short period of time when they're just trying to figure out what they're going to do with them, so they put them in solitary confinement. But in a lot of cases, it's not a short time, and they just kind of keep them there. And they also put them there when they feel like they're being disruptive to the way that the administration is running, or the facility is running. So there's been really short cases where they've been there in just like a couple of hours, and there's been cases when they've been there for a couple of months. The fourth one would be for medical isolation. Obviously, if they are sick and they can, it's a contagious type of illness. But also they put them in the medical isolation if they have mentioned that they're having like thoughts of suicide, which is really like ironic because the risk of suicide increases when they're in solitary confinement. So out of our case study in Florida, we looked at the Florida jails and Florida prisons. So from our Florida jails, we found a lot of information of children or young adults, young people who were put in solitary confinement pre-trial. So some of those numbers were, we talked with 4 people who reported being placed in protective solitary confinement for up to 3 months or more, and while they were under the age of 18. 21 people reported being held in disciplinary solitary confinement. 7 of those said that they were placed in that disciplinary solitary confinement more than one time, each of those times being at least 15 days. 14 young people reported being put in administrative solitary confinement, and usually were being kept there for different disciplinary infractions. And then 5 people reported spending time in medical solitary confinement, 3 of them after they mentioned that they were having suicidal thoughts. And the numbers are very similar for the prisons. We had 6 young people who reported being in administrative solitary confinement while they were under the age of 18. 3 of those people reported being in there for 3 or more months. So I really wanted to mention all of that before I got into the bills, just because again, there's no specific solitary confinement bill being placed right now, and actually printed out all of them. start at the beginning so I can, is not one it gives police enforcement the option to, instead of directly arresting those students, to just give in a civil citation, and then that will kind of like eliminate the problem of, funneling them into the system. The second one is the juvenile sentencing. That one's getting a lot of support. Actually, there was more updates about it just yesterday. It was still moving along. So what that one is doing, it would give juveniles with like a life sentence without parole a chance to get a hearing within 25 years. So right now in Florida, we have the highest numbers in sentencing our youth to life without parole. So there's really like no option for them to show that they are being rehabilitated and that they can, come back to being a, functioning member of the community. So what this bill would do is after 25 years, they would get that opportunity to show that, if they have been following all the rules within the prison and get another hearing and a chance to get out. Last year, there was a similar bill introduced, and it actually said that after 50 years, they could get a hearing. And it was critiqued for being too harsh and obviously didn't get the support and they rather shut it down. So 25, they settled on 25 years yesterday, so it's still a little extreme, but it's better than 50. So it's getting a little bit more support. Senator Joyner is working on that committee for that, and she's from Tampa. So it's a very local issue that we can start getting involved and showing support. The third one would be the juvenile justice education programs. And again, there's a big concern of these children being placed into the systems and not getting any sort of education. So what this bill would do is ensure that they have to get education. And if they have to get education, they're less likely to have to be locked up in a room that's that small without it. So it would also help some of that. So those are the three that, based on all the information that we have, we feel are more movable. And are moving along. The information that I printed it out yesterday. So it has like on the bottom, the last update as far as like if it's scheduled to vote or if it passed some subcommittee. So it's like the latest of the latest as of yesterday. But if you go to myfloridahouse.gov, you can track any of the bills and just keep following them. So that's really important as far as like what can, this group of people do right now. It's really track the bills. We are at the beginning of session right now, so everything could like move one way or another. So it's really important for us to show support, especially if our representatives locally are supporting and working on this issue. So we have like more of a voice. And I think that's all I have.